application, and there's a court decision called in Teague, spelled Teague, that says that procedural cases do not apply retroactively. Substantive issues do. And so the question is, how will the Supreme Court rule on this issue of a hearing? We don't know that issue right now.
Right. It's interesting. I just read Teague versus Lane this morning. And I think there's a distinction there in this retroactive application. We're not talking about direct, because we're talking about these 323 individuals on a collateral review. Is that why you're relying on Teague versus Lane? Because it is.
Yeah, and that's it. And okay. Representative Robinson, meet John Bursch, our Solicitor General. John, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I do, and I do plan to get into this in more detail in my testimony. Which
so you'll see him again. This is not. He's not jumping. He's not jumping the crowd here. So.
Yeah.
I just want to.
But yes, because it's collateral review. If you have a situation where someone's appeal is pending at the time of the U.S. Supreme Court decision, then you get the benefit of that decision.
So. All I want to know is that your rationale and your reliance on Teague versus Lane is because these 300 and some young men or women are going to be addressing the issue on collateral review?
Not all of them. A very small number of them did have direct appeals that were pending at the time of Miller v. Alabama. They will get to take advantage of the court's ruling about the hearing. But everybody else, yes, and that was the nature of the ruling of the Michigan Court of Appeals and People v. Karp, as well as 2 federal courts of appeals, as well as the Florida Court of Appeals, all of which have applied Teague exactly that way.
Since you mentioned HARP, it was decided I was looking at November 15th of 2012. Has leave been granted in the Supreme Court?
It is not. The request for leave is still pending.
So we don't know whether the Supreme Court of Michigan will review it or not?
That's correct, although I've got some thoughts on that I'll share during my testimony.
Thank you.
And it's hard to say, as a former judge on the Michigan Court of Appeals, what and when the Michigan Supreme Court may make a decision on granting leave or not.
Right. The other question I have is that you brought the families. You know, I've practiced criminal law and represented many young men who have been accused, or women who have been accused of murder. You've brought 3 of the heart-wrenching stories to us today. But looking at many of those young men, those juveniles who are in prison right now, many of them had bad lawyers. Many of them, the circumstances, like Mr. Graves, Representative Graves mentioned, aiding and abetting, where the person was merely present. Did you give consideration to all those cases and highlight those for the benefit of this body? Those individuals who are in prison where there is questions about whether they were represented, questions whether they really merited a conviction of murder in the first degree. I personally have knowledge of many that don't, didn't get a fair trial, and are wrongfully convicted of, they're culpable, but not of murder in the first degree. So I'm wondering if your office looked at those victims and looked at those young men in prison's cases too.
You know, we try to do our best to hear the voices of people in Michigan and voices of victims. And I, in response to Representative Gray's comments about felony murder and aiding and abetting, let me just go back and say that the 2 things kind of screening discernment occur. One, when the prosecutor makes a decision whether or not to charge a criminal defendant as an adult, really is part of the degree of culpability and the outrageousness or the seriousness of the homicide. Or every homicide is serious, but the activities and circumstances and facts around it. So every homicide is a serious one, but if it's, you know, heinous and even ultra outrageous, that adds to the decision making of a prosecutor, as Jessica Cooper will talk about, I'm certain. And then secondly, there's a jury. Yes. And a jury makes a determination as to whether or not the facts and circumstances warrant a conviction.
There's my final question. I don't want to take up the whole morning.
It's all right.
As to recidivism, murders, there's very little recidivism with murder. Are you aware of that?
Well, you know, I know the recidivism rates in Michigan.
I'm not talking about all. I'm talking about murder.
Yeah. Well, all I can say that, you know, when a murder occurs, it's final, and that death is forever.
But the rehabilitation, the redemption of an individual who has committed a murder, they're not likely to go out and commit another murder. I mean, there's exceptions. I mean, the examples you used showed the lowest and the basest of our souls, the evil in all of us. I mean, the capacity for evil that we all have. When you brought the 3 examples of the homicides and how terrible those individuals acted. But most times, murder is an instantaneous thing. Very, very rarely does a murderer, is there recidivism with murder.
Well, we know